And today's meeting is on women and the far right with Judith Orr, who's author of Marxism and Women's Liberation and Abortion Wars. And also she has an article in the latest International Socialist Journal, which is out at the moment, and you can purchase that here at the festival, and these ones at Bookmarks. So Judith will speak for about 35 minutes, and then there'll be time for discussion and questions. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Judith.
Okay, morning everyone. Thanks for getting here at this time. Right, first I'll start with a snapshot that hopefully will just give a sense of the sort of things I'm going to cover and really what we're looking at today. And that is the EU election results. People have talked a lot about the far right and how well, say, the League, Salvini, who's the leader of it in Italy, did, Marine Le Pen coming top of the poll. But did you know that it was the biggest number of women ever elected to the EU Parliament this time around? That was about 39%, which ain't bad. It's better than what Westminster, the gender balance of Westminster. But really what I find quite interesting is to look at the next thing. How many of the far-right MEPs who were elected are women? Let's look at the biggest hitters, the ones who won the most votes. In Poland, the Law and Justice PIS party, they won 26 seats. That's a lot. 10 of them are women. France's National Rally, which is the former Front National, they won 22 seats. Half of those MEPs are women. When it came to Italy, as I say, the League really smashed it, had an enormous vote and came out top of the polls. More than half of its 28 MEPs elected for the League are women. That is 15 women. So here we've got a bit of a contradiction going on, and I want to explore that and talk about what's going on. So we're going to look at what the rise of the far right means in terms of attacks on women's rights, reproductive rights, abortion rights, the drive to resurrect the whole cult of motherhood, which we're seeing. But I'm also going to look at some new developments that challenge some of the assumptions that are previously had about the far right, that it's all about angry white men, or as one academic put it, it's about building a masculine national project. And I think, you know, when we look at it, there's all sorts of things that I'm going to look at as part of this. There's a number of far-right women leaders, not just MEPs, and the fact that the politics of women's rights has become central to some sections of the far right to pursue their racist rhetoric and narrative, and actually many of them are targeting the support of women voters and members in their racist project. So these are the contradictions I'm going to look at. What do they mean? What does it mean for us as socialists? First of all, it's worth saying, for the purposes of this meeting, just as I have in the new article in the journal, I'm going to use far right to cover a whole gamut of different organisations, because really it would hold me up to sort of define each one. So whether it's racist populist party or a fascist organisation, I'm going to call it far right, partly because there is some generalisations to be made about some of the developments I'm describing. And, you know, it's not even just as simple as the more right-wing an organisation is, the more traditional views they have on women. It's actually more complicated than that. We have to look at some of the specific national conditions, material conditions of each organisation. For example, you know, how much has been won for our side, how much the consensus in that particular country is pro-LGBT rights, or pro-women's rights, access to abortion, for example, has an implications for how the far right argues. Very different in Poland, for example, where the leader of the far right party has said that LGBT people are a threat to civilization, not just for Poland, but for the entire Europe, for the entire civilization that is based on Christianity. So very different how they build than, for instance, how the far right builds in, say, Sweden or Norway. So there are national conditions in specific contexts, but there's also general points that we can make. And it isn't even just how much we've won the consensus, because look at what's happening in America. In America, there has been abortion, legal right to have access to abortion since 1973. LGBT rights have been won in many places and across, in terms of even just absorbed into the culture, with all sorts of problems. Don't get me wrong, I'm just making generalization. But the fact is, Trump was able to win on a campaign of pushing the clock back on all of these things, on a misogynist, anti-women's rights and racist campaign. And I think that sense of that populist campaign, he stood as a Republican, he didn't stand as a far-right But, you know, we know that he ran a populist campaign, and we know that his election has given huge confidence to the far right across the globe. And so there we can see the possibility even of clocks turning back on what might have been the consensus. So the danger is there's nothing that's ever set in stone, is there? Things that we've won. There's always the potential, if there's no fight, that things can be pushed back. But first I just want to spell out really the sheer scale of the threat to women's rights that we're looking at. I mean, we've seen attacks in recent years on already severely limited abortion rights in Poland. So the far right, in conjunction with the Catholic Church, in fact at one stage it got too much even for the Catholic Church because women were going to be punished, but we saw them push back by fights, but the far right came back for more. In Brazil, when Bolsonaro was elected, he closed the Department for Human Rights and created a Department for Family Values. This is headed up by Damaris Alves, who has said that we want a Brazil without abortion. Now, we all know you can never have a country without abortion. You just have a country with dangerous abortion if you make it illegal. But in the US, again, as I've said, with Trump's election, we have seen an onslaught on women's rights to access abortion. Not just in America, which is severe. You hear about Alabama, but this is going on every week, new attacks. But it's the global gag and the impact it has around the world. But it isn't even as simple as the far right provide a threat to women's rights on abortion. We're also seeing ideology and even legislation in some places that encourages women to reproduce for the nation. Or as the Polish government's adverts say, breed like rabbits. There is a new obsession with birth rates that reflects what the far right calls the replacement theory. Now, some of you will be familiar with the replacement theory. Remember when the far right marched in Charlottesville in 2017? They said the Jews will not replace us. In Christchurch, when that terrorist went and shot up the synagogues, his manifesto was called The Great Replacement, and the first lines of it were, it's the birth rates, it's the birth rates. Fidesz leader Orbán, Prime Minister of Hungary, he said a major problem is that Muslim families have more children than European families do. This flows into policies and ideology that we've not seen really since the time of Mussolini and Hitler. I'll tell you what the policies are like, and really I spell out how much these echo policies of the fascist era in the article in the journal. In Hungary, tax cuts and money for babies, effectively, is being offered to married couples under 40. They receive a loan of 27.5 grand, a low-interest loan. With the birth of each child, the repayments get postponed, and if you have a third child, the loan is written off. If you happen to go on to have a fourth child, that woman never has to pay tax for the rest of her life. In Italy, they have a new scheme which basically says does what it says on the tin. Land for children. Pretty clear. They don't mess with beat around the bush. You'll get a plot of farmland if you have 3 children or more, given to you by the government. And I mean, in Hungary, they even give you loans for a big car to carry all these children around it. But of course, it isn't even just that they attack abortion rights, that they encourage women to reproduce and give them tax cuts and all the rest of it. Not all women are encouraged to reproduce. Of course, because they're racist, aren't they? So Orbán, he says, instead of just numbers, so for him, it's not just birth rates, we want Hungarian children. And when it comes, for instance, for things like saying a woman doesn't have to pay tax the rest of their life, this implicitly attacks for instance, a large minority in Hungary, the Roma people, many of whom are unemployed because of racism, who will never pay tax, and therefore having a tax cut for having a large family, which, Roma families are always shown to have, they think, the far right, that they have too many children, that actually this doesn't actually help them. So actually it is about more Hungarian children, not more Roma children, not more immigrants. He says that migration for us is surrender. I mean, Geert Wilders in the Netherlands posed the fertility rates of Muslim migrants as a threat to the country, calling it a Muslim tsunami. He got taken to court for this and challenged, but actually he won his case. You also have in the US a new thing of women who, on social media and elsewhere, call themselves trad wives, capital letters. These are white women, far-right women, who boast about how many white children they are having for the nation, for the movement. So you see here the weaving together of reproduction on the one hand and racism on the other, with an idea, and this is something that has always been the case when it comes to movements that want to have racial purity, biological racism, scientific racism, all the different words have been used. And did you know it had been rebranded? The far right loves to rebrand things. It's been rebranded as human biodiversity. And this sounds positive, doesn't it? But biodiversity, we're all for diversity. But what it means is you're white people, you're black people, you're Asian people, you're something else. We're all diverse, we should keep separate. That's what they argue. So be aware of these phrases that can be used. But actually what you're talking about is the resurgence of eugenics. Now I know Roddy's going to talk about this tomorrow morning, looking forward to his meeting, so haven't got time for detail. I mean, I've written about it in my other two books here. But the eugenics, the ideas of eugenics originated in the UK. They were from Britain, from England, actually partly from the university that I went to, UCL. And it's all about, the poor are breeding too much. They're going to, water down the British stock. What we want is middle-class women, and all of the aristocrats having more children. That's really the eugenics. And actually some races being seen as inferior. These ideas were taken up with enthusiasm by the US government at the beginning of the 20th century, where they had whole immigration policies based on them, and sterilisation policies. That's what I've written about, where black women in hospitals in the South went in for some operation and were sterilised without their consent and sometimes without their knowledge, because they didn't want any more black children. And so therefore you're seeing a situation where this ideology, it had mainstream support until, of course, the Nazis took it to its murderous logic with the Holocaust. And then, of course, the mainstream support was, forced to fall away. But, let's not think that this was just about the Nazis. The Nazis were the culmination, if you like, of where these politics end up in the Holocaust. But it's not even just all of these things that I've gone through. It's not just about abortion rights. It's not just about reproduction and racism banding together. It's even the study or discussion of gender has become a battleground. For example, Fidesz in Hungary again. The study or discussion of gender, Fidesz has shut down degree and postgraduate courses in gender studies by abolishing their state funding. And one of the founders of Fidesz, Laszlo Kover, said, "We don't want the gender craziness. We don't want to make Hungary a futureless society of man-hating women and feminine men living in dread of women and considering families and children only as barriers to self-fulfillment." The Alternative for Deutschland, another far-right party in Europe, manifesto states that it wants to terminate the promotion of gender research. The AfD leader opposes discussion of sexuality with children before puberty, saying, "I don't want anyone with their gender idiocy or early sexualization classes coming near my children." Now, for those who don't know, the leader of the AfD who said this is a woman, is a lesbian, who brings up two children with her lesbian partner. And yet, so these are some of the contradictions we have to tease out. In Italy, the leader of the League, Salvini, on Mother's Day sent wishes to all mothers, but not to parent one or two, because that's how people, same-sex couples, are put down in birth certificates and all the rest of it. So that was a jab at that. And he's even trying to do a decree that when you register a minor, that you have to have mother-father, not parent one or two. Now, it's been blocked at the moment, but this is the whole idea about going back to traditional roles. So. And then Bolsonaro, when he came back from his first meeting with Trump, he said, "We agreed on all these things," a whole big long list of things, including that we oppose gender ideology. Actually, I don't quite know what gender ideology is, but obviously what it means is any challenge to the orthodoxy on gender in society. And when we look at this, we're not looking at just a few bigots lashing out in a sort of random way. This is a strategy of turning the clock back. Some of the ideas we're familiar with from the past. But it's something to see the level of overt support we have for these ideas that it is the shocking thing. But I said there's also new elements to this, and what about that? Well, something that is completely unprecedented, and that is the number of far-right parties with women in their leadership. From the high-profile Marine Le Pen, that most of you will know about, there is lesser-known but fast-rising Giorgia Meloni. Remember her, because she's going to keep coming up in the future. She's the leader of the Italian Brothers. And then of course there's the AfD leader that I mentioned, Alice Vidal. The co-leader of the AfD is a woman. She's now an independent, from Petri. The Deputy Prime Minister of Poland and Vice Chairman of the Poland's Law and Justice Party is a woman. Siv Jensen, leader of Norway's Progress Party. The Deputy Leader is another woman. She's tipped to be the next leader. And the co-founder and former leader of the Danish People's Party is also a woman. But it's not even only about the role of these women and the fact they're so high profile in leading these movements, or it's not even about the personnel. There's also something else. And it's the fact that women's rights have been appropriated by the far right in their racist rhetoric against Muslims. Now, as an aside, but a very important aside, it's important to remember that the weaponisation of the issue of women's rights to attack Muslims was started and whipped up by mainstream politicians, by Bush and Blair in the War on Terror, when, you remember, Barbara Bush and Cherie Blair wore a little cut-out bit of a burqa, you know, with a pin on their clothes, saying that this was because the war in Afghanistan was for women's rights, etc. You know, or Cameron attacking multiculturalism. You know, this was started by the mainstream, but it's been most effectively picked up and used by the far right. What we're witnessing now is sexism being rebranded again, often successfully, as an import to the West brought in by immigrants, in particular by Muslims. And we're told that Muslims' culture is intrinsically backward and threatens Western enlightened values and modernity. And we've seen this across the board in France, Germany, Sweden, Netherlands, Finland and Denmark. And some academics have coined the process as being gender equality has been ethnicized, or elsewhere it's been termed as the racialization of sexism. But all of it is an attempt to try and understand what's going on here. And now a number of European states actually police their immigration policy and citizenship policy with a commitment to gender equality as a condition of citizenship, as if women were no longer unequal in the West. You know, as if we'd won women's equality and sexism no longer existed. I mean, I'm sorry if I didn't get the memo. You know, we've still got a lot to fight for here. And, you know, this is something we could come back to it. I mean, as it happens, of course, some of you might say, but racist narratives about white women having to be protected from the threat of non-white predators is nothing new. And that's true. In fact, it's one of the oldest racist tropes that there is. But what makes it different is actually it's been adapted for our times. Now, sexually liberated white women are threatened by Muslim men. In fact, more than that, sexual liberation itself is at risk from Muslim immigrants. Marine Le Pen makes it explicit. She says, I am scared that the migrant crisis signals the beginning of the end of women's rights. And this is one support in France. You know, we have to admit this, because when you look at the ban on the hijab, after that the ban on the niqab being worn in public, and a situation that was done in the name of women's rights and actually did win the support of some feminists, leading feminists, and some of the left. And actually what you're saying is Muslim women have no agency. They can't make choices about themselves. The scarf is imposed by men, Muslim men, so the story goes. So we're going to liberate you, and to liberate you, we're going to punish you. We're going to fine you. We're going to other you. We're going to attack you in the street. Some sort of liberation. And I think it's also worth noting, and I think it's an interesting thing to say, that being uncovered has become now synonymous with sexual liberation. Only last week, do you remember the big heat wave in France? Dangerous, you know, it was, you know, a health emergency. Two municipal swimming pools in Grenoble in southeast France, where the temperatures were very high, were shut down because 7 women campaigners went there in burkinis, you know, the sort of coverall swimsuit, defying the ban on burkinis in these public pools, and they were shut down. And these women had a banner. They were applauded by some of the locals. I think that's very much worth noting. But the pools were shut down because it was meant to be, you know, unsafe, having these people in burkinis in the pool. And Le Pen denied it, saying the burkini had no place in the French Republic. And tomorrow there's going to be a protest called by the right. It's called an everyone naked protest to defy Islamism. And this is what they say. We invite all the citizens attached to the values of the Republic to get naked in front of the commandos in burkinis. They want to extinguish the Enlightenment. Together, let's drop the bathrobes. Long live secularism uninhibited. I mean, this is what they're trying to do. Think of the use of words, commandos. These are women in swimsuits in a public pool. This isn't just in France. The Danish People's Party complained in 2010 when a video that was being shown to introduce immigrants to life in Denmark, it's called A Life in Denmark, they complained that it didn't include images of topless women in the video. And they said if it had included images of topless women, it would show immigrant women, now they're coming to a country where there's freedom. Here you can be free. Here you can be yourself. I mean, we're living in an Alice in Wonderland, aren't we, really? Where the far right, the racists, are claiming they care about women's rights, claiming they're the only ones who care about women's rights, and claiming that it's always been part of their worldview. I mean, you know, what do we come to in a way? And actually, you know, when we say that, the idea that the far right are saying, here you can be free, here you can be yourself. Not if you're a Muslim woman, not if you want to choose not to wear a bikini, not if you want to cover up, not if you want to express your religion. As socialists, we say, To be free and to be yourself means wearing what you want, when you want. We reject anybody telling us what to wear, whether it's a Muslim woman wearing what she wants or whether it's any of us. The idea, women have always been attacked for not conforming to what the current norms in any society are. Whether you're covering up too much or showing too much. We're attacked on both sides, aren't we? It's a no-win situation for women. And as socialists, we absolutely reject that, let alone defining this as liberation. You know, this is not something that we accept. But why is it that this whole issue of women's rights has become so important to the far right? Well, we have to see and accept the far right has become a mass phenomenon. I mean, it's a serious electoral force now, isn't it, in many countries? And they couldn't have achieved this with just being simply gangs of street thugs, in a sort of stereotype, if you like. And they've widened their base, and women are an important part of this. Targeting women is a strategically necessary. It's a recognition of our times in some ways, you know, that women are a political force to be reckoned with. Now, in my article, I explained that even in the 1930s, fascist organisations had to in some way acknowledge that women had different aspirations after the First World War. Many of them had been jobs, become financially independent and stuff. So even they, to some extent, acknowledged this in some sort of their policies. But really, today, we're seeing something qualitatively different. And to be clear, my argument is not that the far right is using arguments about women's rights simply to win women, though that's part of it. It's part of a broader strategy to feed into the Islamophobia that's already existing in society, to fan it in order to win wider support. And although it's part of a wider strategy, of course, no party fighting to win electorate can afford to ignore half the population, can it? And the women leaders of the far right play an important role in making the far right acceptable or attractive to women voters. I mean, you know, they play on this, they use it in their policies. So Le Pen says that she's constantly juggling work, shopping, children, and this wretched feeling of guilt planted in the heart of every mother. Now, if that didn't come out of her mouth, it could have come out of a trade unionist or something, but of course, she's trying to say, I'm like you, I face the same problems as you. Meloni in Italy, you know, one of the Italian brothers, she was attacked by former ally Berlusconi. So, you know, they fall out sometimes, because she was pregnant and was standing in a constituency that he wanted one of his people to stand in. And he said, a mother cannot dedicate herself to a job as terrible as administering Rome. And Meloni won great support when she retorted, no one can tell a pregnant woman what to do. So that sense of them saying we're standing up for women is actually something they use. And make no mistake about it, this strategy is having an effect. Look at the membership of the FN, as it was then, in the 80s. Women were less than 20% of it. By 2012, this was up to 45% women membership, and that is continued to rise to today. But again, we go into layers and layers of this. It's not just about numbers only. It is about numbers. In elections, numbers matter. It's also that winning women supporters, reframing racism in the language of progressive politics, if you like, is part of the process of bringing far-right racist politics into the mainstream, of making it respectable, of breaking the stigma of belonging to or supporting a racist party. It's about bringing it in from the margins. But of course, when you look at all of this, you know, you get people, you know, people have said to me when I've talked about that, I was working on this, but how could women support the far right? They're such an implicitly reactionary and oppressive set of politics. You know, how could any women support them? Well, first of all, there's always been a minority of women who supported fascist and far-right parties. Again, go into it in more detail in the article. And often they've just been dismissed as wives and girlfriends of fascists. Now, of course, sometimes they are wives and girlfriends of fascists, but actually sometimes they're choosing to have racist policy. And I think that, you know, some people find it hard to understand. But to be honest, I think for us as socialists and Marxists, it's not inexplicable. Because we argue that really we understand the experience of oppression doesn't automatically mean that you feel solidarity with other people facing discrimination in society. You know, women can be racist, women can be homophobic, gay people can be racist. You know, it doesn't automatically mean that we immediately feel unity with everyone. And sometimes we can internalise our own oppression, behaviours and ideas. You know, I'm sure there's been some mothers who've said to their daughters, you're not going out in that. What's that doing? That's internalising society's view of what young women should wear, etc. So, you know, there is a sense that we know that people can absorb this. And also sometimes you lash out at those people who live near you, you blame them for the problems, instead of the big structural things about society, which seem so abstract, don't they? Capitalism, the system, even politicians who live such different lives. And I think that sense of that, we also have to recognise that some women actually are attracted to the idea of a right-wing version of supporting them of giving them a role, valuing them in society. There's no question there is a minority that look to that as well. So the main thing to absorb from this, really, this bit of it, is women's experience of inequality does not inoculate them against racist ideas, and we've seen this historically and today. So the threat of the far right today cannot simply be explained by a set of politics that looks only at gender. It can't be about toxic masculinity and all the rest of it. This is not about men. Though, of course, men dominate in these parties, as they do in most conservative general right-wing parties in the world. We have to look at everything else. And meetings across Marxism this weekend will look at it. Class, the effect of economic crisis and people feeling there's not enough to go around, the normalisation of racism, instability and security being blamed on migrants, and most of all, when there's cuts and everything else, very importantly, the lack of a really big working class collective alternative for people that makes them feel like they can fight in a united way. But there has been resistance. It's not that there hasn't been any, and I think it's important to actually remember that. Some of it's been absolutely inspiring. I mean, of course, when Trump was elected, there was the magnificent women's marches, wasn't there? Across America, 100,000 in London, across the globe, and these have carried on. But we've seen demonstrations in Poland, both responding to the attacks on abortion rights, the black protest, the women's strike. These were huge breakthroughs in Poland and really meant something quite extraordinary. And also in Poland in October, when the far-right marches, an annual march, this year in October was 100,000, abortion rights activists went and confronted them at the front. I mean, really courageous stuff, at the front of their demonstration in Warsaw. In Italy, when the absolutely disgusting World Congress of Families, I explain who they are in this, but anti-abortion, wanting to have the tradition family, when they held their conference in Verona, tens of thousands took to the streets against them and their sexism and their anti-abortion policies. In Germany, more than 100,000 have marched against the AfD. And in Brazil, Bolsonaro has faced numerous demonstrations, hasn't he, about education cuts and about sexism. And the whole theme of the Rio Carnival this year was against the sexism of Bolsonaro. And the spirit of this opposition really shows the potential of building resistance to the resurgence of the far right, at a time when women have been fighting back in the Me Too movement and other global movements across the world. And, think about it. I remember talking on abortion rights at Marxism last year. Even in the last year, our side has won a magnificent victory in Ireland against the bigots who wanted to keep abortion being utterly illegal. And so because of that fight back, from January this year, women have access to legal abortion for the first time ever in Ireland, in the Republic of Ireland. Now, of course, there are problems with it, all sorts of, about access and everything else, but this was struggle making a difference in the day-to-day lives. And actually, coming from Northern Ireland is something I always have to say, is the North has to be next. The North has to be next. The idea that I can spend, 7 pages of a talk, about what the far right are doing and how they're attacking women's rights, when a part of the UK doesn't even have the most fundamental right to control fertility and to access abortion, I think has to be noted. And that's not just my private passion. This is something that has actually now got broad support within Northern Ireland, even among DUP voters, as well as across the UK. We are, and to be honest, for me, this is also a sign of the times that women's rights are in the spotlight. Women's rights are being addressed, and that's why looking at these contradictions and not just seeing the far right as a gender question, as something that we have to address politically, is absolutely vital. So we have to sum up, we have to challenge the far right ideologically as well as confront their mobilisations. And we have to expose the dangers of those who want to give any ground at all to the idea that there's something superior about the West, that Western values, suddenly Western values are all about equality and stuff. I've never heard that. They weren't saying that when they were building the British Empire. When they kick Windrush generation people out of Britain, when they attack disabled people and cut away their rights. I could go through a long list, every meeting in the, of course Western values are not superior. In fact, the Western values are dog-eat-dog, capitalism, neoliberalism, and attacking the most vulnerable. So we have to argue and point out that if there's any accommodation to that, like there has been in France, you have a situation where it only deepens racism, deepens Islamophobia, and a situation that we have to stop. And so I think we have to say, we don't allow the far right or any politician cannot be allowed to justify their racism and their racist rhetoric, their Islamophobia, by claiming it's in the name of women's rights, by claiming it's pursuing something better for women. It's not. It's not only attacking Muslim women in particular, but actually it's an attack on us all. Don't tell us what's liberating, whether it's covering or uncovering. We define our own liberation. All of us, don't we? That's the essence of liberation for us as socialists. We wear what we like, we have babies or not, our bodies, our lives, our choices. For socialists, the fights against racism and women's oppression can never be separated. One oppressed group will never make gains by further oppressing another. So we have to fight for unity in struggle. While all the time we fight to unite as a class, that's where we can find our collective strength. That's when we know people feel different. That's when we know that people stop blaming each other and start to look upwards. That's the brilliance of struggle. It not only changes things, like the repeal of the 8th did change the law, it lifted people. People blossomed. People demanded more things to change in their society. That's what struggle can do. When we unite as a class, we find our collective strength. And all the time, through all of this, whether the struggle or not, we as socialists, we make the socialist case for the struggle to win a society, not just where the far right can be put back in the dustbin of history where they belong with the lid firmly locked on, but for a society where all of us can liberate ourselves. That's the key thing. We don't look to somebody else to liberate us, where all of us can liberate ourselves, all of us, from all oppression and exploitation. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Judith, because I've been really looking forward to this meeting. I think it's a topic that we should be speaking about, a lot more. You can see in the timetable there's like 1,000,001 meetings on women's rights, and there's also loads of meetings on the rise of fascism, the rise of racism, but this is the only one which is kind of conjoining the two together. And I think like you said, quite often, not only is the fascist space dominated by men, but quite often so is the kind of anti-fascist space. And I think it's like a really important thing that we've also got women at the forefront, in the pushback against the far right. There was just a little few things that I wanted to talk about. Firstly with the maybe I'll skip past that, but I think this idea that the sexism is being brought over by immigrants and that, in the West, we've got some sort of like brilliant equality is absolutely, it's utter crap, man. Like, if you actually think about it, the societies in the world where we can think of examples which have got the least amounts of sexism are things like the Aka people in the Congo, or, the Masuo people in southwest China. And, these are communities where, like, the Aka people in the Congo, the women go out and do the hunting, the men stay at home and they cook and they look after the children. The Masuo people, they don't even have a word for husband or father in their language, because women just choose, there's no concept of monogamy, and actually women aren't stigmatized for like not knowing who the father of their baby is. So, this kind of idea that like the global south and like the east are like this like sexist kind of like havens is like absolute bollocks. And then, for them to then continue to be like, oh, here in the West, when you've got men being like, oh, get your tits out and that means you're free, like, it's an absolute, it's a disgrace. It doesn't make any sense. Like, it's absolutely mental. And I think, it's really important to know that, like, young women who are socialists, anti-racist, anti-sexist, we are the #1 target for the far right. They hate us more than they hate right-wing men. Like, you can see this in the kind of incels that are coming up, these like little kids on their laptops who get really angry because loads of women don't want to sleep with them and they blame women instead of like, society and themselves. And you just kind of think like, and it is because the reason why they hate us so much is because they're scared of us. Like us in the SWP and on the radical left, like we put women at the forefront. We say that it's about a woman's choice. I'm not going to stand here and let a white man tell me what a Muslim woman should wear or shouldn't wear. And and you can see how angry they get on demos. They always come for the young women because we're right at the front of it. They're shouting at you, they're screaming at you, and especially the women on the far right demonstrations, because I think they can see that we're there telling them that the myths they're spreading, are completely wrong. And I think we shouldn't be fooled by this. Like, misogyny is endemic within far-right ideology. They've been smart enough to warp the argument just to kind of mask this sexism, but I don't think we should get it wrong. You know, if the fascists ever did take power, women's rights would be the first thing. You know, they'd smash the unions, they'd come for the socialists, and then they'd roll back on every single person's rights who isn't a white man. And you know, I just think it's really important that young women are at the forefront of this fight. We need to fight for our space, and you know, make sure that history is not rewritten to make out that kind of like right-wing people are like the bastions of women's rights, because we all know it's absolute bollocks. But yeah, thanks.
Okay, I'll try not to move it. I think that like what we see with the prevalence of women in right-wing organisations really shows that women's liberation is a class issue, and this is something that we need to keep arguing for in our campaigns and in our workplaces, because because I can't remember what I was saying. You know, for especially like, and with the abortion rights, you see that these attacks aren't things that are going to affect women with money, because they have the option of travelling out of state in America or like over to England to get abortions, but that's just not an option for the people who need these rights the most. And I think when we talk about why women are leading these things, we have to say it's because the oppression doesn't affect them in the way that it affects working class women. And I think that we need to break down the myth that oppression affects everybody in the same way, and that's really important, and that's it. Thanks.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. People will have seen the sort of whole furore in Birmingham, which started off in Birmingham, it spread to other places around sex and relationships education. And I think what's interesting about that is obviously there has been a concerted attempt to portray all Muslims as, you know, reactionary in terms of sexuality, in terms of sex and relationships education, which I think as socialists we absolutely defend, you know, from primary school upwards, as is in the NEU's terms, age appropriate. In other words, we think children should be educated about relationships, whatever, you know, of all kinds from the word go. But I think it's interesting that, first of all, the stereotyping of all Muslims is that, but secondly, some very strange alliances are emerging, aren't they? When you hear that some of the, you know, basically fundamentalist Muslim leaders of those protests have been meeting with right-wing racists like Katie Hopkins, it makes you think about the kind of alliances that are actually coming up over that. And then, actually, just to add to that, and I found this really interesting, leading member of the NEU Teachers Union told me last week that in Nottingham, SPUC, the Society for the Protection of the Unborn Child, had also been leafleting schools against sex and relationships education. You thought, why does this not surprise me? Because actually you are seeing together this sort of amalgam of right-wing people sort of lining up, and as I say, some very, very strange alliances emerging. And I think that's why you actually have to think really hard about how you do actually kind of fight on all these fronts simultaneously. You cannot sort of separate women's oppression from racial oppression from LGBT rights, because otherwise you end up with this sort of, you know, in which people are ending up getting set up against each other, rather than fights like, for example, the fight against austerity, which I think has been key, obviously been key to the rise of far right, actually needs to have women at the forefront of it, and black men and black people and whatever, because actually that's how we actually start to overcome those kind of hideous and very dangerous alliances.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to say it's absolutely disgusting and hypocritical for the likes of Marine Le Pen to attack Islam for being denigrating to women. This is the same people that actually, as a result of their policies, they ended up with state troopers on French beaches forcing women at gunpoint to strip if they're wearing bikinis, you know, so we cannot give an inch to these vile people. And also look at who is really the biggest threat to women's rights and equality on this planet. The likes of Trump, the likes of Orban, the likes of May. 2 women a week die because of domestic violence in this country. People don't even talk about it. And what does our female great sort of feminist female, I'm a feminist wearing t-shirt, loving may do about it. She actually reduces child benefit. She puts all sorts of addendums on how many children you can have, and you have to prove that you were raped if you have more than a certain amount of children. How does that progress the women's movement in any way, shape or form? Also, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of 2 women a week die in this country, what does she do to help these women in these terrible situations, often because of poverty? She closes refuges, you know, so we've got to really be hard and really, really be clear that the biggest threat to women is the likes of these people. Trump talks about how backward Islam is, and he's actually supporting people that deny women the right to choose. So you get people that have actually died. We don't want to go back to the 60s before the Abortion Act in this country, where you had people dying in the street because of backstreet abortions, and we have to be really, really, really hard about that. My mum used to be in something called the Older Feminist Network, which was some sort of mad thing in the sort of 70s and 80s, and one of her really good friends that she actually fell out with, a lot of these right-wing groups in France who are really, really well funded, they were targeting the feminist groups and the women's groups in this country and inviting them to come over to France to demonstrate to get rid of women being able to wear the hijab in France. So they used to pay for, one of my mum's friends unfortunately got suckered in, they used to say it was about women's rights, so they used to pay for these people to go over on Eurostar every Saturday and give them like all this money for lunch and everything. My mum was arguing this is right wing and you can't do it, and ultimately they fell out. But this is what these people are. They really target people who've got the right sort of motives, but how it can actually lead to people, like I say, at one point being threatened to have to strip on the beach. And actually, I think any time you get the chance, I don't know if people just start to wind up on this, but recently, someone in UKIP, they've got this great policy now. I can't remember the name of the guy, but you'll tell me. But they're now trying to campaign to not allow women to wear the hijab and the niqab in public, and the interviewer was really, really brilliant. So he said, "Oh, you're worried about people who are covering their faces and hiding their faces. So is your next policy going to be to stop people and to ban people who wear very big, large brimmed hats?" And he got really confused and said, "What do you mean? What do you mean?" He said, "Well, if you're worried about people covering their faces in public, you must be really concerned with people that wear really wide-brimmed hats." And because these people are so stupid, they didn't even really know what to say. So I think people, don't be defensive at all. Some of our brothers and sisters in the mosques have been the best at defending women's rights, the best at defending gay rights. Mohammed Kosbar, who runs the Finsbury Park Mosque, that's attacked every day, his family are attacked, his kids are threatened with rape and murder. He stands up for gay rights, he stands up for women's rights any chance he can, and everybody in that mosque does, and we've got more in common with the people in that mosque than any of these right-wing scum, whether they're men or women.
I just wanted to talk about the experience of Birmingham, really, because it's been a hell of a 5 months. It's been really, really difficult. So you've probably heard about the protests outside the schools. It's reached national news and a national profile, and predominantly Muslim schools. So 98% of the school children are Muslim in the schools, and protests outside them. So you know, both of the schools that have where the protests have taken place, the number of hours in the school have been cut by 2 hours a week. So you'd hope that there is collective struggle you could point to as a way of uniting people and bringing people together over issues that affect all children in all schools all over the country. £6 billion of cuts in schools, but it's not that simple. It's been very, very hard because of in terms of what's taken place, and as socialists we've had to be very fierce about the arguments and take them on and not avoid them. So of course we're defending LGBT and sex education in schools, but at the same time we've got to make sure that we don't give 1 inch whatsoever over Islamophobia, because waiting in the wings after Trojan Horse and all of the things that happened in Birmingham, Spark was the one that came immediately afterwards to try and organise amongst the parents 4 years ago and stir up amongst the parents with their revolting and disgusting campaign, and that's the root of it. They're the ones that kicked Andrew Moffat out of his school in Handsworth. They are the ones that brought a legal case against him. They're the ones that were at the forefront of that witch hunt. And of course, it is a community that's been relentlessly under siege and under attack. So what we did is we formed supporting equality of education and diversity in schools. We fought for LGBT Muslims to be in the leadership of that. We made the Facebook group we've kept closed because we don't want it all over the press and being used right, left and centre by various different people, from Peter Tatchell to Ofsted to God knows who, that might want to try and use these things. And we've kept a discipline campaign where we fought within it. We've smashed out any Islamophobia in it, and we've fought to take part in as many broader initiatives as we can. So the first time in 22 years, LGBT Muslims led Pride in Birmingham, and they're going to be... And they're going to be sharing their story at UK Black Pride, and they're going to be on the National Pride as well. And the formation of this group is to fight for all equality in all schools across Birmingham. We're going to fight for an equality charter that we want to win from below and that we want to take out into every single community. We want to do it through the City Council that's smashed the equality department and that has allowed academisation that takes place that allows them to blame the academy chains, the heads and whoever, and put all the responsibility down the chain, when really it's a national issue and we need to be fighting for it together collectively.
I think what goes wrong as well is that there's still a liberal definition of feminism, that women in organizations is progress. And one Dutch socialist says, well, that means that some people say fascism okay as long as it has boobs. And I think that's a very clear remark, and I think that's part of a problem, because it enables these women in right-wing organizations to be part of a facade of progression, but also they feel like they have to match the sexism of the leaders by being even more sexist. I think that's what you see. And I think in the Netherlands we have some very good pushback from groups who organize against Islamophobia, because women who wear hijab and headscarves are the main victims of Islamophobia. They've been documenting these racist attacks because the system doesn't do it themselves, and they've been organizing themselves as groups in women's marches, as with Muslim women. So I think we have to support this self-organization also by trans people who are facing attacks. And we have to find platforms to organize together. I think the women's strikes were interesting initiatives taken further by the United States and the Manifest for Feminism for the 99%, and then developed further into Spain, where they had 24-hour strikes. And they actually revealed fascists who went on the street and had speeches, and they say, look, masochista, we know who you are, we know what your agenda is, we won't stand for it. So I think these are hopeful developments, and I was also wondering if people from the audience could talk maybe more about uniting together and showing that we need a feminism for the 99%, we don't need more divide.
Yeah, a few years back now, but when Tommy Robinson and his motley crew were coming around Manchester a lot, well, they started to anyway, one of the groups that popped up, because we had, the Football Lads Alliance, the Democratic Football Lads Alliance after a split not long after that, and then another group turned up called Gays Against Sharia. They came into Manchester and they turned up and they were going on about, oh, Muslims are all homophobic and transphobic, and we support you really. We don't agree with all these Muslims. And we started looking at them and going, you were the guys throwing bricks at us last week when you came around as the frickin' Democratic Football Lads Alliance. So from that. From that, we ended up forming LGBT Against Islamophobia, and I'm pleased to say that we've been keeping that going as much as we can. We've been turning up we're turning up with the banners at every single fascist event we can, and also make sure that they know that we do not believe them, because we know that as soon as they've gotten rid of as many Muslims as they can, we're next. And it's not even just that we're next. We're currently on the front. Trans people especially are currently on the front line anyway. You have people who have horrible little cockroaches like Milo Yiannopoulos going around. Being the little token gay in the fascist movements, who's thankfully now lost a lot of his credibility, seeing due to his horrific behaviour around the idea around paedophilia. But But this is a problem. They will inevitably end up trying to befriend other people, befriend minority groups when it suits them. And you have to counter it incredibly quickly, incredibly efficiently. Otherwise, they will end up recruiting people. There's now a very large amount of white gay people, I mean, there always has been, but that are incredibly racist towards Muslims. It is a massive problem. You've got to get at that. You've got to stamp it. And the women's movement is a massive forefront of this because women's rights are under attack in pretty much every country at the moment. And if we can't make sure that our women's groups smash out the idea that the far right is anything remotely like a women's support area, then we won't win. The women's right has to be right at the forefront so that people know full well that these are not their friends. They will betray us as soon as they can, and we just got to get rid of them quick.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to come back to what Judith was saying about it being really important that liberation comes from ourselves. You know, it's not imposed on people from above. That isn't really what we call liberation. And I think it ties into what you were saying about actually for socialists, what becomes really important is having really hard, sharp arguments on the ground. And I think one of the really sort of emotive things about women's rights, one of the really sort of areas where this comes to the forefront is around the area of sex work and the sex industry. And there's all sorts of conclusions that people can come to about our attitudes to that, depending on basically whether they think that liberation comes from ourselves or not. And I think in Sheffield, this has really come to the forefront. There is a lap dancing club in Sheffield that was campaigned against very strongly by people campaigning for women's rights, saying there is no place, for this type of thing. Incidentally, it's right next to the student union, one of the student unions in Sheffield. However, recently the workers in that club have been treated very, very badly, and they are campaigning for better treatment in their workplace. And this has led to kind of a split in arguments about how we should respond to this. And some people can come to the conclusion that, well, actually, we're against the objectification of women, we're against the exploitation of women, we're against the idea that we should have sex work or any of these types of clubs, whatever term you might have for it. And therefore we shouldn't be supporting these women. What we should be doing is campaigning to have this club shut down, effectively making women unemployed. And of course, what we would argue as socialists is actually, although we don't want these things to exist in society, they do exist in society, and these are working women who are campaigning for rights in their workplace, and we support them doing that. But at the same time, we still argue for a society that there is no need to have these places, there is no need for this exploitation of women in this way. And I just think it's a really clear example of how people need to liberate themselves and how we as socialists need to have these really hard, sharp arguments in preparation for actual fights when they develop.
Yeah, the whole narrative that the far right are somehow defending women's liberation is like really sickening to your stomach, isn't it? And when Judith was talking, I was remembering round about this time a little bit later last year, the day that I think that I felt that the most strongly was when we were up outside Boris Johnson's constituency office having a protest that Stand Up to Racism had called just after his comments, was discussing sexist and racist comments about niqabi women. And the demonstration was being sort of organised and led on the day by myself and two Muslim women comrades who are both hijabi wearing comrades. But what you had was, because the DFLA had just had their big march, or the FLA at that point, or whatever it was, but the supporters of Robinson had their big march and were feeling a bit cocky. They'd come up and organised the demonstration across the road from us. So we were there, speaking out about how outrageous it was what Johnson had said. And it started off with these, some of them were fascists, some of them were far right, etc. They were actually attracting people in the local community, because I think that's the danger of it. They plant a flag, and in a context where things are polarised, people can gravitate around that. So it wasn't a great situation. But what they started with was saying, "Oh, where's your husband? Does he know you're out, or you're allowed to do this?" But it went from that by the end of the protest to them literally shouting, and it was a woman who was shouting this: "You're alien, you're not allowed in this country." And we were just, these two comrades are not, if people probably know who they are, are not people that are going to shy away from that. So we're actually having to hold people back a bit. But we just want, it was so infuriating and, terrifying actually in a sense, because you thought if these people get any kind of foothold to be able to you know, we just had the big mass demonstration of 15,000 of them marching through Whitehall. But really what the past year's been about, I think, is through Stand Up to Racism, we've gone from that point, you know, a real question of whether or not, you know, unions had faith that we'd be able to take them on, and you're really having to fight to win arguments about how to build mass movement. We've had 4 national demonstrations, we've outnumbered them a whole number of times. All those demonstrations have been led by women, including Muslim women, which has been fantastic. But, you know, we also, if you look at the campaign in the Northwest, I think it must have really riled Robinson that every little town that he seemed to go to in the Northwest, there was a hijabi woman with a megaphone and with a crowd of people, you know, standing there to stand right in his face and say, "You're a Nazi." And, you know, at the end of his campaign, that's what he said. Everywhere I went, people said I was a Nazi. I think that the Trump thing is, just to finish on this, the Trumpism is really about trying to normalise both racist language but actually misogyny and bring that into, you know, the mainstream discourse in a way that we wouldn't have even seen from even the most racist ends of the establishment a few years ago. It wouldn't have been deemed as something acceptable, and it's trying to make that acceptable. And it's also got a very unifying impact on people, because it brings together all these different movements in their hatred of the man who's the world's #1 misogynist, the world's #1 racist, the world's #1 climate denier, and all these other things. But you can actually see how in the Tory leadership election campaign right now, people like Boris Johnson are looking to kind of model themselves a bit on that Trumpism. So we have this bizarre situation, I'll finish on this, in the week where police are called to his house because of a potential situation of domestic violence, where another Tory MP has grabbed a woman by the throat, and the far right are all rushing around to defend that, while saying that throwing a milkshake is apparently an act of violence. You then have Trump coming out later that week and talking about the Australian immigration system, which is one of the most nastiest, racist, brutal systems, and really trying to signal to the hard right inside the Tory party that he's their man. So I think we have to continue to build that mass anti-racist movement, and we have to have women at the forefront in it, and that's why you should all book up for the international conference on the 19th of October.
I think what's quite frustrating with when people talk about the women's liberation movement is that it was founded, and the backbone of it was women in America, in the States, after the abolishment movement of slavery came to a realization that they had no voice and they had to fight for their voice. And I think it shows the history of the connection between the women's liberation movement and the fight against racism. And I think sexism and racism go very hand in hand. You see the language around slavery, the attack on black women saying that they're quite sexualized, and the attack on black men saying that they will rape our women and so forth. And you see that continuing today towards Muslim men, and you see how it's going towards Muslim women saying that we're incredibly submissive, or we're this exotic thing that we have, like people have to go for in some sense. And I think it shows how deeply they interlink with each other. But what frustrates me, like as a Muslim woman, of course, is how people say we're submissive and so forth. It's like, and like the Western world, and you talk about the question of sexism, but why is Me Too happening? Why is that a thing if you're so liberated and women's liberation is a thing? And how dare you say that when all you want to do is break, when all most people want to do is break the glass ceiling, but in reality it's Muslim women across the world who are leading revolutions, whether it be in Egypt or whether it be in Sudan.
Side of the peachy top at the end. Sorry to make you run everywhere. Also, any quick questions? We've still got some time. Anyone sort of not sure about things, please put your hand up.
Yes, I think people are right to talk about the centrality of Islamophobia to the far right, and the centrality of the idea that Muslims are a threat to women. But if you look at the people around Tommy Robinson and the FLA and DFLA marches, you know, a lot of the banners and a lot of what you hear on those marches are around what they call grooming gangs, what we might call child sexual exploitation. And I think there's a kind of a soft layer on those marches that maybe just think, oh, we're just against the extremists, or maybe we should be a bit concerned, or you know, maybe they're concerned because they believe what the media says about how the police didn't arrest station men because they were concerned about political correctness. But there's also a hard fascist core on those marches that, you know, really do believe that they're in this war of East versus West, that, you know, the Muslims are going to replace the white Christian West, that George Soros is involved in a conspiracy to bring more Muslims and refugees in, you know, stuff that you'd associate more with the 1930s. I think there are different responses to it. I think for some people, even perhaps some on the left, there's an idea that maybe we should kind of capitulate a bit to some of these ideas and say that, oh, you know, maybe there is a bit of a problem with certain communities, etc., etc. I think we should absolutely, reject that idea. I think, we should, we should. That doesn't help really, is what I'm saying. It just kind of fans the flames. It just makes them feel justified in being part of those marches. It gives them the opportunity to say, look, even the left agree with us. We should say that the idea that the police are not arresting Asian men because they're concerned about political correctness is absolute nonsense. We know what the police are like. The Muslims are constantly under surveillance by the police and the authorities. And black men as well are much more likely to be arrested, stopped and searched and even killed by the police. They're not worried about political correctness. The problem is that the police don't listen to women, especially young and working class women. They said that they were prostitutes and all and that they voluntarily went into those situations, all that kind of thing. So I think the SWP is right to be absolutely be hard at making those arguments, and socialist workers had some really good coverage of the whole issue of sexual exploitation that I think it would be right to do.
Just there, sorry. The green top. Is it? Oh, there goes the mic.
Thank you, Judith. That was a fantastic talk, and it's really good to be here today after Wayman's meeting yesterday, where he was really crystallising the argument that the far right is building street movements and it's building, an aggressive force within our communities, but at the same time, working within different nation states, mediating local kind of prejudices and so on to normalise the ideas of the far right. And I think that Judith's talk today really shows why all these contradictions and strange bedfellows and what this is happening and at the same time this is happening, it's really explained by the way that the far right is attempting to garner support in contradictory circumstances across Europe, in different countries, different cultures, different traditions. But what is at the heart of it all is the creation of an authoritarian society where certain things are permissible and certain things are not permissible. And I'm reminded of New York in the 1960s. One of the things the Stonewall riots were about was about the rule that you had to wear 3 items of clothing that were suitable for your gender. I won't kind of sort of go into that any further, but this is the kind of authoritarian rule that all the far right are aspiring to, and they have to adapt it. I want to mention somebody that the older people in the room might remember, a woman called Victoria Gillick, and she really exemplified. She was a right-wing anti-sex education, anti-abortion rights, anti-contraception for teenagers campaign, anti-contraception campaigner. I mean, she was absolutely vile. She had, I think it was 10 children, and she specifically didn't want her girl children to have access to information about contraception and so on. She campaigned around that. And what was it about her that made people attracted to her, men and women? I think we've really got to understand that the alienation that men and women experience, if you've got somebody coming along saying you can be proud of your fertility, you can be proud of your motherhood, you can be proud of being the top man in your family, you can be proud of making the rules in your family, you can be proud of controlling your children. Thank you. This is what right-wing ideas appeal to, and that's how they can gain traction, because they are feeding into alienation. Thanks.
So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Judith.
Thanks for that great discussion, and I'm sure we could go on all day. There is so much to discuss in this, and so much to understand and untangle, and that's why it's brilliant. We've got a whole weekend more still to come of Marxism and to go through it. Just a couple of comments then to come back on some of the things. I think that the idea that having women in positions is progress and stuff is something, I think sometimes there's a bit of a sense that women are just naturally nice. And they're going to be better. A nice fascist, a nice warmonger, a nice politician. You know, there is, do you remember the nursery rhyme? Sugar and sweet and all things nice. And boys are made of puppy dog tails and stuff. So there is a cultural sense that women are more caring. Now, this comes, doesn't it, from our socialisation. There's nothing natural about any of it. But I think that sense, and so, when, you see, we are for more women everywhere. We are for more women bosses. We are for more women politicians. We want a situation where it's 50-50 throughout society, because that would represent a less sexist society. Would it mean automatically fewer wars, fewer starving children, fewer cuts? No, because it matters. The politics matter. The class interests matter. So the gender is not what divides. It's about class and divisions and class interests. And so, I think that sense of when I'm exposing the fact that there are women leaders of fascist and far-right organisations, when there are increasing support among women, this isn't to say that they're worse or I hate them more than the men. I hate them all as being racist and fascist and far-right leaders, but I'm exposing the fact that there are more women involved and more women leading is an example and expression of a greater reach that they're having, of a greater sense of the support that they're winning and the greater danger they are that we've got to combat. And so these are both contradictions, but they're also a reflection of what's going on. And I think that sense of their success in expanding their base is something that we've got to expose those contradictions. We've got to challenge their assertions to be representing women's rights. And, it can seem easy. We all agree with that. But when you see what's happened in France, you can see what happens when there is any accommodation to the idea that in some way the West is superior. And when I said about the uncovering, you see, I'm all for uncovering if that's what you choose to do. I'm all for covering up and wearing a bikini if that's what you choose to do. But I absolutely will not have people telling me that one thing or the other is by definition liberating or not liberating or oppressive or a man has told me. It is about the fact that so many women are being treated as they don't have their own agency. I think this is something we've got to come back to. But you see, when we come to class, when I say we should want more women everywhere, why did Hillary Clinton lose against Trump? And she went on about, wouldn't it be fantastic, a woman in the White House? Well, if you look at what I said before about 50-50, well, yeah, it would be significant, wouldn't it? It would be significant to have a woman president, the first ever. But if it's somebody who's part of the political establishment, who is a warmonger, who's going to continue being a warmonger, who is going to continue to trash working class jobs across the country, etc., well, lots of people, including working class women, didn't think that she was going to be an alternative for them. She didn't. So therefore, the sense of actually saying that all women have got some common interest. I don't have a common interest with Hillary Clinton. I don't have a common interest with Theresa May. So there isn't a common interest across our gender. Those people, those women, have class interests which trump their any interest in gender. So even if sometimes, absolutely right, they can always get access to abortion. Absolutely right, they can always, their pay, maybe less than the men, but they still are paid a zillion more pounds than any of us are ever going to earn in a lifetime. Now, I'm for them having equal pay, because that is a representation of, of sexism. But actually, at the end of the day, they want to perpetuate a divided society, a society in which women's oppression is built in to capitalism. It benefits them. Women's oppression, divisions, racism benefits them. That's why, Theresa May and others, they don't balk at Islamophobia. They're launched right completely into it. So we need to sort of understand their class interests. And I think that when we talk about what's going on at the moment, and I think, I talked about rebranding a lot, and I think it's important to understand that even though there are echoes of the past, and certainly in some of the traditional far-right parties, many echoes of the past, fascist organisations, ideology, but we have to understand that constantly changing. There's no homogenous far-right or fascist organisations. They've got lots of different ideas and like I said, in the context of various national political situations. But a situation where we're fighting sometimes new battles in new ways, we have to. But the fact is we have to keep coming back to what it really represents. What it really represents to have a fascist movement. What Tommy Robinson really wants to do. What is the project? And it's not just about Tommy Robinson, it's about the people that march with him, that look to him, including some women, and including some LGBT people on the far right, and who want to try and intellectualise the whole thing as being a sort of libertarian project. And I think, we have to get involved on the ground, as I was saying, confront, whether it's, joining Stand Up to Racism, being a part of Unite Against Fascism, being on those demonstrations is absolutely vital to show our numbers. When it comes to fighting sexism, we want to fight every expression of sexism, whether it is, as you mentioned, sex workers and how they're treated. And we were absolutely for defending their rights. Defending their right not to be sexually harassed, police harassment, violence. They're mostly the most vulnerable to those things. Every expression of sexism, wherever it rears her head, or unequal pay, like the Glasgow strikers took on. Every expression. But actually, we are socialists. We don't want to just be constantly fighting against things. We want to fight for something as well, don't we? That's what makes us get up in the morning. And therefore, that sense of actually saying, do we want to come back, generation after generation, and fighting the latest rebranding of racism and fascism. The latest woman leader who claims that, now everything's equal now because I've got myself a position. This is what happens if we don't actually fundamentally challenge the system itself, which breeds fascism, which breeds racism, which breeds sexism. So that's what being, a revolutionary socialist is all about, isn't it? We need revolutionary change. We need to fight every day on those issues, but we also have to have a vision of a society where nothing is bought and sold, whether it's in a lap dancing club, whether it's food on the table, whether it's clean water, housing, shelter. None of these things are bought and sold to be a commodity. That's what a social society is. A social society where nothing's a commodity, where each of us can grow and blossom as individuals, and where sexism and racism will be gone forever. That's what we're fighting for here. That's what this Marxism is all about. I hope today you will join us in that fight for a revolution that will bring about a social society that we can all be proud to live in.